The rain hit Grace's face like needles as she sprinted across the intersection in Gangnam, heels cracking against wet asphalt. A leather folder clutched to her chest like it held the only proof of her existence. Horns blared. A taxi swerved. She didn't stop. Somewhere behind her, a black car crawled along the curb, keeping pace, and she knew, that if she slowed down for even a second, the men inside would catch up to her before she reached the building where the one person who could stop what was about to happen was waiting behind glass doors 20 floors up. She didn't know yet that in less than 6 months, the man she was running toward would be the same man she'd be running from. She didn't know that the folder in her arms would end up being the very thing that broke both their hearts and healed something that had been broken for 8 years. All she knew, in that moment, soaked to the bone on a Seoul street that still didn't feel like home, was that her father's name was about to be cleared, or she was about to lose everything all over again. Before any of that, before the rain and the folder and the black car, there had been an ordinary Tuesday morning, and an audit that was supposed to be routine. Grace had been in Seoul for 6 years by then. She'd built a life there the way people build things when they have no other choice, carefully, quietly, brick by brick, never quite trusting that any of it was permanent. She worked as a forensic auditor for a mid-sized compliance firm that contracted out to conglomerates needing their books cleaned up before quarterly reviews. She was good at her job. She was good at noticing the things people tried to hide. It was, if she was honest with herself, the only skill she had left from the life she used to have. The life before her father lost everything, before the heart attack that took him 18 months later, before she'd packed 2 suitcases and gotten on a plane because staying in Lagos meant staring at the wreckage every single day. She still wore his watch, a simple gold-faced thing with a cracked leather strap she'd never had repaired, because somehow keeping it broken felt more honest than fixing it. That Tuesday, her firm assigned her to a new client, Shin Group, one of the largest conglomerates in the country, expanding aggressively into logistics and shipping. Routine compliance audit. Standard paperwork. She almost didn't think twice about the name. Almost. Something about it sat wrong in her chest the moment she read it on the assignment sheet. A small itch she couldn't place, like a word on the tip of her tongue. She told herself it was nothing. Korea was full of massive conglomerates with generic-sounding names. She had bills to pay and a visa that depended on steady employment. She packed her laptop and went. The Shin Group building occupied an entire block of downtown Seoul, 40 floors of glass and steel that seemed to swallow the sky. Grace walked in wearing her sharpest blazer, the one that made her feel like armor was real, and was met at reception by a man who would, in a matter of weeks, undo every wall she'd spent 8 years building. His name was Min-jun. He was tall, leaner than the suits around him, with warm dark eyes and a small scar above one eyebrow that she'd later learn came from falling off his bicycle at age 9, racing his cousin down a hill he'd been told not to ride. He greeted her in careful, polite English, then switched effortlessly to Korean when he realized she understood more than she let on, a small smile tugging at his mouth like he found that charming rather than intimidating. "You're the auditor everyone's afraid of," he said, walking her toward the elevator. "Should they be?" Grace asked. "I don't know yet," Min-jun said. "Ask me again in a month." She didn't laugh, but something in her chest loosened slightly, and she hated how easy that was. If this story is already pulling you in, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and there is a lot more coming. The first few weeks were exactly what they were supposed to be. Spreadsheets, meetings, cross-referencing invoices against shipping manifests, the tedious architecture of corporate compliance. Min-jun was assigned as her liaison, walking her through departments, introducing her to staff, smoothing over the friction that came from an outsider poking through a company's private records. He was good at his job in a way that surprised her, not because he was ruthless, but because he was decent. He remembered the names of the security guards. He brought her coffee without being asked. He apologized, genuinely, when a document she needed took 3 days longer than promised. Grace told herself she was simply doing her job. She told herself the same thing on the day he walked her to the subway station, because it was raining and he didn't want her waiting for a cab alone. She told herself the same thing the following week, when he sat across from her in the cafeteria and asked, without any performance in his voice, what it had been like moving to Korea by herself. Lonely, she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. Everyone here already has their circles, their people. I'm just orbiting. You're not orbiting anymore, Min-jun said simply, and went back to his rice, like he hadn't just said something that made her chest ache. She called her younger sister Rose that night, like she did most nights, the 8-hour time difference meaning Rose was usually eating breakfast while Grace was getting ready for bed. You sound different, Rose said, suspicious, the way only a younger sister can be. Who is he? Nobody, Grace said. Someone from the audit. Grace. Rose's voice sharpened instantly, years of protectiveness compressed into a single syllable. Please tell me it's not someone from that company. It's a big company, Rose. I work with dozens of people. You know what I mean. Grace did know what she meant. Rose had never fully let go of the anger that their father, James, a proud, hard-working man who'd built a shipping and logistics company from a single rented warehouse in Lagos, had been utterly destroyed 8 years ago by a business deal that still didn't make sense to either of them. 1 year he was expanding into 3 new ports. The next year the company was hemorrhaging cash from accounts that didn't reconcile, contracts that didn't exist, partners who vanished the moment lawyers got involved. Within 18 months the company was gone, the house was gone, and not long after that, so was their father, his heart giving out under the weight of watching everything he'd built collapse into nothing. Rose had been 15, Grace had been 22, and it had been Grace who found their father on the kitchen floor. Neither of them had ever gotten a clear answer for what had actually happened. James had died before he could explain it fully, muttering only fragments in his final months. A name, a country, the word betrayal, that never resolved into anything solid enough to act on. It's not that deep, Rose, Grace said finally. I'm just doing my job. But that night, lying awake in her small Seoul apartment, she found herself thinking about her father's face in those final months. Gray, hollowed out, muttering half-sentences about people he'd trusted. And she found herself, for the first time in years, wanting to actually look. The rooftop happened 3 weeks in. Min-jun brought her up after hours, ostensibly to show her the view, though they both understood it was an excuse. Seoul spread out beneath them in 1,000 small lights, and for a while neither of them said anything. The silence comfortable in a way silence rarely was between two people who barely knew each other. My father built all of this, Min-jun said eventually, gesturing at the skyline, at the building beneath their feet. From nothing, he started with a single warehouse. People used to laugh at him, said a man from a fishing town in Busan had no business trying to compete with the big trading houses. He proved every single one of them wrong. Grace felt something cold slide down her spine at the words a single warehouse, but she kept her face still. You admire him, she said carefully. More than anyone, Min-jun said, and there was something so unguarded in his voice, so genuinely proud, that Grace felt sick with the certainty that whatever was coming would break something in him she had no right to break, and yet couldn't stop herself from digging toward. My father built something too, she said quietly, a shipping company, in Lagos. Min-jun turned to look at her properly then, something shifting in his expression. Built, past tense? He lost it, Grace said. A long time ago. I don't fully know what happened, just that it happened fast, and it happened wrong, and he never recovered from it. Min-jun reached over and took her hand, not in any grand gesture, just a small, steady thing, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it, and that only made the cold feeling in her chest worse. She didn't sleep that night either. The discovery came on a Thursday, buried in the kind of archived records nobody was ever supposed to look at twice. Grace's actual assignment required her to trace 10 years of transaction history across Shin Group's shipping and logistics divisions, verifying that current filings matched historical records. It was tedious, exacting work, The kind that had made her good at her job precisely because she had the patience most people lacked. She was cross-referencing a decade-old shell account, one of dozens created during an aggressive expansion phase 8 years prior, when a name surfaced in a subsidiary ledger that made her stop breathing for a full 3 seconds. Nwosu Logistics, Lagos, Nigeria, her father's company. Her hands were shaking as she pulled every related document she could find, cross-referencing account numbers, wire transfers, dates. What emerged over the next 4 hours, piece by piece, was not a picture of competition or bad luck or an unfortunate market downturn. It was a picture of surgical, deliberate sabotage, falsified contracts designed to manufacture a cash flow crisis, siphoned accounts routed through 3 shell companies before disappearing into Shin Group's own expansion fund, a manufactured bankruptcy engineered with the precision of men who had done this before and would do it again. Her father hadn't failed. He had been dismantled, piece by piece, by a company that wanted his shipping routes and didn't want to pay full price for them. And at the top of every authorization chain, every signature, every final approval, one name, Chairman Chae Dong-wook, Min-jun's father. Grace sat at her desk long after everyone else had gone home, the office empty and dark except for the glow of her monitor, staring at 8 years of grief rearranging itself into something with an actual shape, an actual face, an actual name. She thought of her father's gray, hollowed-out face in his final months. She thought of Rose, 15 years old, watching their world collapse with no explanation. She thought of the word he'd whispered before he died, betrayal, and understood, finally, exactly what he'd meant. She thought of Min-jun's hand around hers on the rooftop, his voice full of pride when he talked about the father who had built all of this from nothing. She put her head down on the desk and cried until her chest hurt. If you've ever discovered something about someone you love that changed everything you thought you knew, comment below, because we want to hear your story too. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. She didn't tell Min-jun, not that week, not the week after. She told herself she needed more evidence before she said anything, that she needed to be certain, that the professional thing to do was to let the audit run its course and let the facts speak for themselves. But the truth, the one she didn't want to look at directly, was simpler and uglier than that. She was afraid that the moment she said it out loud, whatever they'd started building on that rooftop would be over, and some small, traitorous part of her wasn't ready for that yet. She called Rose that Sunday and told her everything. Rose was silent for a long time on the other end of the line, and when she finally spoke, her voice was flat with a fury that had been waiting 8 years to have somewhere to go. "You have to destroy them," she said. "You have proof now, Grace. Real proof. You take it to every regulator, every journalist, every single person who will listen, and you burn that company to the ground. That's what they did to Daddy. That's what they deserve." "It's not that simple," Grace said, though she wasn't sure anymore which part she meant, the plan, or the fact that burning down Shin Group meant burning down Min-jun's entire life along with it. "Why not?" Rose's voice cracked. "Because of him? Because of the sun?" Grace didn't answer, and the silence answered for her. "Grace," Rose's voice went quiet, dangerous. "Please tell me you have not fallen for the son of the man who killed our father." "I don't know what I've done," Grace whispered, and for the first time in years, she let herself cry in front of her sister, instead of after she'd hung up the phone. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Grace's life since the funeral. She continued the audit by day, sitting across from Min-jun in meetings, watching him laugh at something a colleague said, watching him defend his father's legacy, in casual conversation, with a warmth that made her stomach twist every single time. By night, she built her case in secret, cross-referencing bank records, tracking down archived court filings from Lagos, reaching out carefully, cautiously, to Mr. Balagun, her father's old business partner, now old and frail, still living in Lagos, one of the only people alive who might remember something useful. Balagun remembered more than useful. He remembered everything. He had kept for 8 years a single ledger, his own private notes from the final year of Nwosu Logistics, documenting conversations, meetings, suspicions he'd never had the resources or courage to pursue after James died, and the company dissolved and there was simply nothing left to fight for. He photographed every page and sent them to Grace over a shaky WhatsApp connection, his hands visibly trembling in the video call that followed. "Your father knew," Balogun told her, his voice thick with age and grief. In the final months, before his heart gave out, he knew it was Shin Group. He was building a case, he just ran out of time. Grace sat with that for a long time after the call ended. Her father hadn't just been a victim. He'd been fighting back, quietly, until his body gave out before his will did. And now, 8 years later, his daughter was going to finish what he'd started. In a country he'd never visited, against a company that had no idea what was coming. Meanwhile, Min-jun was falling harder, and he didn't know how much danger that put him in. He started talking about the future in small, careful ways, mentioning an apartment near hers that had just opened up, wondering out loud what Nigerian food tasted like because he wanted to learn to cook something for her, asking, one evening over dinner, if she'd ever consider meeting his father. "He'd like you," Min-jun said, entirely unaware of the way Grace's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "He's old-fashioned, but he respects people who work hard, and you work harder than anyone I've ever met." "I don't think that's a good idea," Grace said carefully. "Why not?" I'm not ready," she said, which was true in a way he couldn't possibly understand. Min-jun studied her for a moment, something uncertain flickering behind his eyes, but he let it go, the way people let things go when they trust the person across from them completely. That trust, Grace thought later, was the cruelest part of all of it. He trusted her completely, and she was carrying a folder full of evidence that would eventually tear his family apart. The twist came on a night Grace would replay in her mind for years afterward. She'd stayed late at the office, cross-referencing internal emails as part of the final compliance sweep, when she found a message thread from 6 weeks prior, around the exact time she'd first been assigned to the audit. Chairman Che, in a private exchange with the head of legal, had explicitly requested that the external audit team be reassigned, citing efficiency concerns, a request that had been quietly overruled by the board for unrelated reasons. Buried in the same thread was a line that made Grace's blood run cold, a request to specifically review the credentials of the lead auditor, her, flagging her surname and country of origin as something to monitor. He had noticed her name. He had, on some level, suspected exactly who she was, and tried to have her quietly removed before she ever got close enough to find what she'd found. And he had failed, because Min-jun, in fact, who'd personally vouched for the audit team's competence in an earlier meeting, had unknowingly protected her long enough for her to find everything. Min-jun had, without knowing it, brought the one person capable of exposing his father directly into his father's house. Grace sat with that realization until the office emptied out around her, until the cleaning staff came through, until she was entirely alone with the weight of what she now knew and what it meant she would have to do. She should have told him that night. She didn't, and that delay was the mistake that finally caught up with her. The confrontation happened 3 days later, and it happened because of a phone call Rose made at exactly the wrong moment. Grace had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered, and Min-jun, who had a key by then, who had let himself in to surprise her with dinner, heard it ring and, without thinking twice, glanced at the screen. Rose. He almost didn't answer it. It wasn't his place. But the caller ID showed 3 missed calls in the last 10 minutes, and something about the urgency made him pick it up. "Grace has to tell him," Rose was saying before he could even speak, her voice tight and fast, clearly mid-conversation with someone who was not, in fact, Min-jun. "She's been sitting on this for weeks. She has enough evidence to bury Shin Group and she's still sleeping in his apartment." "Rose?" Min-jun said, and the line went dead silent. When Grace came out of the shower, towel drying her hair, she found Min-jun sitting perfectly still at her kitchen table, her phone in front of him, his face carved out of something she'd never seen on him before. "What evidence?" he asked quietly. "What does Rose mean, evidence to bury Shin Group?" Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her. There was no version of this conversation where she could soften what came next. Min-jun, how long have you known? His voice was low, dangerously controlled, the voice of a man holding himself together by sheer will. Whatever it is, how long? She could have lied. She thought about it for exactly 1 second, and then she understood that lying now would be its own kind of betrayal, worse than the truth, because it would mean she'd learned nothing from watching what silence and hidden information had done to her own family. 6 weeks, she said. Min-jun's face went through something complicated. Shock, disbelief, and then, worst of all, understanding. As pieces he hadn't known were pieces suddenly slotted into place. The rooftop, he said quietly. When I told you about my father, you already knew something. I didn't know everything yet, but you knew enough to keep it from me. His voice cracked on the last word, and Grace realized, with a fresh wave of grief, that she was watching a man's entire understanding of his own life come apart in real time. Grace, what did my father do? She told him everything. The shell accounts, the falsified contracts, the manufactured collapse of Nuosu Logistics, her father dying 18 months after losing everything, gray and broken on a kitchen floor in Lagos, while his younger daughter watched. Balogun's ledger. The email thread where Chairman Che had tried to have her quietly removed the moment he recognized her surname. By the time she finished, Min-jun was standing by the window, his back to her, shoulders rigid. You used me, he said finally, and the words landed like a physical blow. That's what this was. You needed access to the company, and I was the way in. That's not true. Grace's voice broke. Min-jun, look at me. I have never once used what's between us. I fell for you exactly the way you fell for me, and it terrified me every single day because I knew what I'd found and I knew what it would do to you. I was trying to protect you from this for as long as I could, by lying to me, by trying to figure out how to tell you the truth without destroying you. Grace shot back, her own anger rising now. Grief and love and 8 years of buried fury, finally finding a target that wasn't entirely fair, but was the only one in the room. Do you have any idea what it's been like, Min-jun? Sitting across from you every day, watching you love a man who destroyed my family, and having to smile through it because I wasn't ready to lose you yet? So I was just a casualty you were delaying, Min-jun said, and turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd met him, his warm, dark eyes were completely closed off to her. I need to leave. Min-jun, I need to leave, Grace. His voice was quiet now, exhausted in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. I need to think. About my father. About us. About whether any of this was ever real. He left, and Grace sat alone in her apartment for hours, the folder of evidence sitting on her kitchen table, like a verdict she'd already delivered. Rose called an hour later, apologetic and defiant in equal measure, and Grace didn't have the strength to be angry at her. I'm sorry, Rose said. I didn't mean for him to hear that. But Grace, maybe it's better this way. Maybe now you can finally do what needs to be done without worrying about protecting him. Grace looked at the folder on her table. 8 years of grief, finally given a shape, finally given a name, and understood that she had reached the moment her entire life had been quietly building toward without her realizing it. She could leak everything now. Every document, every falsified contract, every wire transfer. She could hand it to the board, to regulators, to journalists, and watch Shin Group collapse the way Nuosu Logistics had collapsed. Watch the Che family lose everything the way her family had lost everything. It would be justice, clean and total, and exactly what Rose wanted. It would also mean destroying Min-jun along with his father, taking down a man who hadn't known any of this, who'd built his entire identity on the belief that his father was honorable, who would lose his career and his family name, and possibly the only version of himself he'd ever understood. Grace sat with that folder until 3 in the morning, and by the time the sun came up over Seoul, she had made her choice. The following morning, she went to Balogun's ledger one more time, cross-referencing every signature, every date, every authorization, isolating with surgical precision the exact paper trail that led directly and only to Chairman Chae Dong-wook. His personal authorizations, his private communications, his direct orders to falsify contracts and siphon funds. She built a case that implicated the chairman specifically and entirely, structured in a way that left no plausible path for Min-jun, who had joined the company only 3 years prior, long after the sabotage of Nuosu Logistics had already been completed and buried. It took her 4 days, working almost without sleep, cross-referencing every document until the case was airtight enough that no lawyer, no board member, no regulator could argue that anyone but Chairman Chae himself bore responsibility. On the 5th day, she requested an emergency meeting with Shin Group's board of directors. This is the part of the story where things get intense. If you want to see how it ends, make sure you're subscribed, because you do not want to miss this. The boardroom was the largest room Grace had ever stood in, all glass and dark wood and a table long enough to seat 20 people, though on that afternoon it held only 12. The full board of Shin Group, called in under the pretense of an urgent compliance disclosure. Chairman Chae Dong-wook sat at the head of the table, immaculate in a charcoal suit, his expression polite and faintly curious, entirely unaware of what was coming. Min-jun was there too. Grace hadn't expected that. She'd assumed he'd recuse himself, given everything. But he sat near the far end of the table, his face unreadable, watching her with an expression she couldn't parse. Grace stood at the head of the room, the folder open in front of her, her hands steadier than she'd expected them to be. 8 years ago, she began, Shin Group orchestrated the deliberate financial sabotage of a Nigerian logistics company called Nuosu Logistics, run by a man named James Nuosu. Falsified contracts, siphoned accounts, a manufactured cash flow crisis engineered to force the company into bankruptcy, allowing Shin Group to absorb its shipping routes at a fraction of their value. A murmur went around the table. Chairman Chae's polite expression didn't shift, but something behind his eyes went very still. James Nuosu died 18 months after losing everything, Grace continued, her voice steady even as her chest ached. He left behind 2 daughters. I am one of them. The room went utterly silent. I have spent the last 2 months conducting a compliance audit for this company, Grace said, and in the course of that audit, I uncovered documentation proving, beyond any reasonable dispute, that this sabotage was personally authorized, directed, and executed by Chairman Chae Dong-wook. She distributed copies of the case, Balogun's ledger, the falsified contracts, the wire transfers routed through 3 shell companies, the internal email thread in which the chairman had attempted to have her specifically removed from the audit upon recognizing her surname. Every signature, every authorization, all of it traced back to one man, and one man only. Chairman Chae's composed mask finally cracked. This is absurd, he said, his voice tight. Fabricated. This woman has a personal vendetta. The documents speak for themselves, Grace said. Every signature is yours. Every authorization traces to your office and no one else's. I have taken care, deliberately and specifically, to ensure that this case implicates only you, and not the company you built or the people who work for it in good faith. She looked, for the first time since entering the room, directly at Min-jun. Including your son, she said, who joined this company 3 years after these events took place, and who has been as much a victim of your deception as my father was a victim of your greed. Min-jun's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his eyes fixed on Grace, with an intensity she couldn't fully read. The board meeting that followed was the longest 2 hours of Grace's life. Chairman Chae's increasingly desperate denials, the board's growing horror as they cross-referenced the documentation themselves, a phone call to legal counsel, a vote, conducted right there in the room, to suspend the chairman pending a full independent investigation. By the time it ended, Chairman Chae Dong-wook had been escorted from the building by his own company's security, his face gray and hollow in a way that made Grace think, unwillingly, of her own father's face in his final months. She didn't feel the triumph she'd expected to feel. She felt hollowed out, exhausted, and unbearably alone. Min-jun found her an hour later, sitting on a bench outside the building, the folder finally empty in her lap. "You could have destroyed the whole company," he said, sitting down beside her without asking permission. "You could have taken everything from me. From my name, my career, everything I've ever known." "I thought about it," Grace admitted. "For one whole night, I thought about it seriously." "Why didn't you?" Grace looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the anger she'd expected, and finding, instead, something raw and uncertain and hopeful. "Because you didn't do this," she said finally. "Because you spent your whole life believing your father built something honorable, and that belief isn't a crime. Because somewhere between the rooftop and this bench, I stopped being able to separate what I owed my father's memory from what I wanted for our future. And I decided I didn't have to choose between justice and you. I could have both, if I was careful enough." Min-jun was quiet for a long time, staring out at the Seoul skyline, the same skyline he'd once gestured at proudly, telling her his father had built all of it from nothing. "He lied to me my whole life," he said finally, his voice thick. "Every story he told me about how he built this company, it was all sitting on top of what he did to your father, to your family." "I know," Grace said softly. "I don't know how to be angry at you and grateful to you at the same time," Min-jun admitted. "I don't know how to hold both of those things." "You don't have to figure it out today," Grace said. He reached over, slowly, and took her hand. The same small, steady gesture from the rooftop, months and a lifetime ago. And this time, Grace let herself hold on. The months that followed were not simple, and the story doesn't pretend they were. Chairman Che was formally removed from the board, facing both civil litigation and a criminal investigation that would take years to resolve. Shin Group, under new leadership, issued a formal settlement to the Nuosu family, not enough to undo 8 years of grief, but enough, finally, to clear James Nuosu's name in every record that had once called him a failed businessman rather than a man who'd been robbed. Rose flew to Seoul for the first time that winter, standing beside Grace as she finally, publicly, laid their father's name to rest the way it deserved, cleared, honored, remembered for what he'd actually built, rather than what had been done to him. Rose was cautious around Min-jun at first, understandably so, but watched, over the course of that week, as he sat with Grace through every difficult conversation, every moment of grief that surfaced unexpectedly, every hard question about his father that he answered honestly instead of defensively. "He's not his father," Rose finally admitted to Grace, quietly, on her last night in Seoul. "I still don't know how I feel about all of it, but he's not his father." Min-jun, for his part, chose not to return to Shin Group in any leadership capacity once the investigation concluded, unwilling to build a future on ground he now understood to be poisoned. Instead, he started something smaller, something entirely his own, with Grace as an unofficial advisor on every compliance decision from day one. A small, deliberate irony neither of them ever tired of pointing out to each other. A year later, on the same rooftop where he'd once told her, with such pride, about the empire his father had built from nothing, Min-jun told her something different, that he wanted to build something of his own, something honest, something they could both be proud of, and that he wanted her standing beside him when he did it. Grace still wears her father's watch. The strap is still cracked. She still hasn't had it fixed, and she doesn't think she ever will, because some things are worth carrying exactly as broken as they were when they were given to you. Proof that you survived them anyway. If this story moved you even a little, do 3 things right now. Like this video, drop a comment telling us what part hit you hardest, and subscribe so you're here for the next one. Because there are so many more stories like this one coming, and you do not want to miss what's next.